Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Unit 6 presentation. So this unit covers Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The first chapter is going to talk about purpose statements. So a purpose statement is like the spine of your research. It controls everything. It establishes the intent, the reason you're doing the study. It is absolutely positively the most important part of any study, and it typically falls at the end of your introduction or problem statement. So what does the purpose statement do? It tells what you want to do. It tells you how you intend to accomplish it. It tells you what your variables are. So there's different types of purpose statements based on the research method. So in a qualitative purpose statement, a good purpose statement has identifies what the phenomena is that you're going to study, who the participants are, and where you're going to do the research. It may not be specifically where the research is being done because you want to be careful of participant confidentiality, but it gives some idea of where the research was done. And usually purpose statements are going to, qualitative purpose statements are going to have words like purpose, intent, objective in there to indicate the qualitative nature of the study. And usually they focus on one phenomenon so that they can really get a very robust exploration of that phenomenon. Action verbs describe, understand, develop, explore, examine, the meaning of, generate, or discover. Those are all words that you might see in a purpose statement. Typically uses neutral words or phrases. You want to be careful of including any type of bias in your purpose statement. So you don't want to say, for example, the purpose of this phenomenological study is to explore the lived experience of veterans who are getting better, veterans with PTSD who are getting better, because that's a bias, they're getting better. Maybe the positive lived experience, that would be another bias. You just want to explore the general phenomena, both all the positives and negatives of it. You want to include words that talk about how you're going to do your inquiry, who the participants are, and also delimit the scope. And when we say delimit, we're setting kind of the boundaries, like who are we going to research? So for example, in my dissertation research, I looked at traditional age African-American freshmen who were in a predominantly white institution versus a historically Black college university. So only people who met those criteria could be part of my study. So that delimited my study. Here's an example of a qualitative purpose statement formula. So the purpose of this, okay, what type of qualitative research study is to do what? What's the verb? And what is the phenomena that you're studying? For whom and at where? And so that's an example of a purpose statement for qualitative. Here's another example from a research study that was done in 1993. And you can see that in this particular study, she wrote that the phenomenological inquiry, as part of uncovering the meaning, articulated the essences of meanings of the mother's lived experiences when their wished-for babies died. So, in this particular purpose statement, it covers multiple sentences, but it all answers all the questions that formula had given us. Here's an example of a purpose statement from a case study. This is the more traditional model for doing a purpose statement. The purpose of this case study was to explore effective social and educational factors that may have contributed to the development of reading disabilities in 4 adolescents. It's a case study, so very small sample. So that's an example of a case study. Here's an ethnography example, and it says the paper derives from a 2-year ethnographic study of student subculture composed of gay, bisexual males at a large university. That's the site. The focus on men reflects the fact that lesbians and bisexual women constitute a separate student subculture at the university under the study. So it's an example. This article contributes to literature by addressing the needs of gays by identifying several areas where progress can be made improving the campus climate. So that's an example of a purpose statement for an ethnography. This is a grounded theory example. You can pause the video and you can read this example as well. And the important thing to remember to know about grounded theory, since we haven't really talked about qualitative yet, is that grounded theory really looks at how a phenomena works, and it's creating a theory about that phenomenon. So when you have a quantitative purpose statement, it's a little bit different in that it's more concrete, more quantitative, of course, and you're going to identify the variables and their relationship, who the participants are on the research site. You're going to want words that really indicate what's going to happen in the study. If there's a theory, which most quantitative research does have a theory or model, you want to identify the independent or dependent variables, and if there's mediating, moderating, or control variables, what are those? Typically, you're going to see words that connect variables like what's the relationship between, or comparison of, describe, or what's the difference of. Components of a good quantitative purpose statement, the order of variables is important. You always have your independent variables before your dependent variables. Mediating variables go between the two. Moderating variables are either after or related to the independent variables. You want to mention how you're going to do your inquiry, reference the participants, and use literature when appropriate to define the key terms in your definition of terms, which would follow your purpose statement. But what's really important is really delimiting your participants so that your variables and who is going to be part of the research are very, very, very clear. Here's the statement of purpose statement formula for quantitative. The purpose of this, whatever type of study, is to test the theory of, or to compare this, or to relate this between this and this, controlling for, and this gives you a great, outline of what that might look like. Here's a purpose statement for a published survey. So you can pause your video and take a look at this purpose statement. Here's a purpose statement for an experimental study. So again, you can pause the video and look at a purpose paragraph and what the purpose of the study is. They advance the purpose of the study right here. For mixed methods purpose statements, this is going to contain both parts, the quantitative and the qualitative, so the overall intent of the study and why you're doing a quantitative and qualitative together. You're going to want to have words that indicate what the quantitative and qualitative are, and you're going to want to indicate the type of mixed methods design, which we'll be studying in a couple of weeks, and then the reasons for combining quantitative and qualitative data. Here's an example of a convergent design purpose study, and the convergent and explanatory and exploratory will make much more sense when we really dig into mixed methods. Here's an explanatory sequential design, and here's an exploratory sequential design. Here's an actual example of a convergent method purpose statement. Here's an example of a explanatory sequential mixed methods purpose statement. And here's an example of an exploratory sequential mixed methods purpose statement. So now we're going to move on to chapter 7, which looks at research questions and hypotheses. And these are directly linked to your purpose statement. So your purpose statement informs how you write your research question and hypothesis. You want to use the same terms, the same terminology, the same phrases. You don't want to change much. Creativity is definitely not rewarded in research. So the purpose of your research questions and hypothesis is to really help the reader know, what are you trying to do in the study, right? What are you trying to do? There's different types of research questions and method and hypotheses for each type. Note, qualitative research does not typically have a hypothesis. Quantitative research has a question and a hypothesis, whereas mixed methods for the quantitative portion will have a question and hypothesis, and for the qualitative, most likely just a question. So qualitative research questions don't deal with hypotheses or objectives. It's really a broad question that guides the understanding or the pursuit of understanding of a phenomena. And then the sub-questions break it down into smaller portions. So usually you have one or two central research questions that are very broad and explore the general phenomenon. No bias, they're going to be very broad, neutral perspectives. You don't want any more than 5 to 7 sub-questions. And oftentimes students will confuse sub-questions with interview questions. They're different. So for each research question, you can have sub-questions that you might dig a little deeper and want to know more about. So if I am exploring graduate student or international student success at the graduate level, that might be my primary question, like what factors contribute to, well, this is qualitative. What is the lived experience of international students who are enrolled in a graduate counseling program? A sub-question might be, how does acculturation impact the lived experience of international students enrolled in a graduate counseling program? So it's a sub-question of that bigger question, but then I'm going to have interview questions that actually break that down even more, that get at the acculturation piece. So you want to also relate the central question to the type of research that you're doing, like ethnography, critical ethnography, phenomenological, or grounded theory. So each type of design has a different purpose and thing that it's trying to achieve. So usually qualitative research questions begin with what or how. They focus on one phenomena, and they use verbs like report, describe, discover, generate, explore, examine, those type of things. They avoid directional question or words like affect, influence, impact, determine, cause, because we're not dealing with causation of any type. The questions are actually going to change in qualitative research, which is something that's a little unusual, because as you talk to your participants, you may realize that you need to change the question that you're asking, or you may need to change your sub-questions, or you may need to modify your interview questions. So unlike quantitative research, qualitative research is is much more fluid in process and responsive to what's being learned as the research is going on. You'll want to use definitely some open-ended questions, and you don't necessarily tie that to theory or literature, although it is possible to do that. And you want to specify your participants and research site. Here's a formula for a qualitative research question. Here's an example of an ethnography research question. Here's an example of several questions for a case study. So that was qualitative. Now we're moving on to quantitative. Quantitative research is about differences or relationships among variables. We want to look at, with our hypotheses, what are the differences, the predictions, or the estimates. So three basic approaches: compare, relate, or describe. This type of research really tests theories about phenomena. And we have to have a way to measure our independent or dependent variables separately so that we can have a way to quantify those things. And we'll write our questions, our hypothesis. We also will have a null and possibly alternative or research hypothesis. The null hypothesis is what we actually test. The null hypothesis typically states there's no relationship or there's no difference. You know, the type of research question we're going to do is going to either look at, you know, who are we comparing, what are we correlating, or what are we trying to describe. And the research questions and hypotheses must flow logically from the purpose statement and the variables. Many research questions and hypotheses in quantitative research are going to try to indicate some sort of cause and effect logic. Correlational research, however, does not. So that form of quantitative does not look at cause and effect. It's just looking at relationship. In the book, it says not to write both research questions and hypotheses, but depending on the type of report you're doing, you might need to write both. So again, as I mentioned, the null hypothesis predicts no difference or no relationship, whereas the alternative hypothesis or research hypothesis predicts the direction of difference or relationship. You also can have non-directional hypotheses, which predicts there is a difference or a relationship, but not the direction. And just, you know, making sure you include all of your variables. Here's an example of a null hypothesis. It's over here. There's no significant difference between the effects of verbal cues. Here's an example of a directional hypothesis, actually several. Here's 7 of them to be exact. So these are all directional hypotheses. Here's an example of a non-directional, which is this one right here. So this first one, and then these two are directional hypotheses. So quantitative research includes both the independent variables before the dependent variables. It specifies what we're going to want to know about each, and if there's moderating and mediating variables, those need to be included as well. So here's some examples of descriptive questions that you might ask as a research question, quantitative research question, and here's a description of how you might ask it from an inferential, kind of like how does that sample inform the population, information about the population. Here are some questions, descriptive and inferential, differentiated, so that you can see the difference. So feel free to pause and take a look at those. Mixed method research and hypotheses include qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods research questions. So it can be any combination. Qualitative and quantitative questions focus on the purpose. Mixed methods questions conveys the importance of integrating both qualitative and quantitative. And when you are doing mixed methods, you need to use the guidelines. Well, actually, any type of research, you need to use the guidelines for how to write the question and hypothesis, because the format of the question, the hypothesis, and the purpose statement is actually very important. So mixed methods, you want to talk about what type of, what order of the research is it going to happen? Is it going to be quantitative then qualitative, qualitative then quantitative, or simultaneously? There's lots of different ways to do that. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. And it informs the methods, the procedure, the content, and then why we're doing it in a hybrid quantitative, qualitative way. Here's an example of mixed methods using methods and content language. This is a research question. And then just in summation, research questions and hypotheses really focus our purpose statement and add kind of sign points, guidance for our readers so that they understand exactly what we're trying to accomplish in our research. Qualitative research has a central question with some sub-questions. Quantitative research describes, relates, compares variables. And mixed methods is a combination of qualitative and quantitative so that you can see how both of those things are both of those methods interact and how that further informs what we know about a phenomenon. That is the end of Unit 6. I hope this video has been helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions.